26%. Business environment used to be 8% of this exam, and now it's 26, which means it tripled while most study material was still treating it as the small one at the end. If your practice book is older than this version, it's underweighting a quarter of your paper, and there's a single distinction running under all 8 of these tasks that decides more answers than any piece of terminology.
Hey everyone, Erica here. 8 scenarios, 1 per business environment task, all of them ours and written for teaching. None is a real exam item and none ever was.
We've walked all 8 tasks across this series. This is the reps, and this domain punishes improvisation harder than the other 2.
This is Michael. Scenario 1, Task 1, Governance. You need a decision on whether to accept a vendor's proposed architecture change. In a corridor, the program director tells you to go ahead. She's 2 levels above you.
And the tempting answer is obvious. She's senior, she said yes, you've your approval, proceed.
Erica. That conflates 2 different things. Governance defines who holds decision rights over what. Being senior isn't the same as holding the right, and a corridor isn't the same as a forum.
And this trips capable people constantly, because in real organizations, senior approval usually does clear the way. The exam is stricter than your workplace, deliberately.
So the right move is to take it to whichever body governance says owns architecture decisions. Her support is genuinely useful there. It just isn't a substitute for the forum.
And there's a practical reason beyond compliance. A corridor decision leaves no record, so when somebody asks in 4 months who authorized the change, the honest answer is nobody did.
And there's a practical test for whether you actually have governance or just an org chart. Pick any decision type on your project and ask who can approve it, at what value, and where that's written down.
If the answer to the third part is nowhere, you don't have governance. You have custom, and custom is exactly what produces corridor approvals.
Which is also why this domain tripled. Organizations kept discovering that undocumented decision rights are where the expensive failures come from, and the exam followed. Erica has been circling something that sits under all 8 of these, so she should ask it before we go further.
And it took me a while to see it. What actually separates a risk from an issue from an impediment?
1 scenario in, and the correct answer was a forum rather than a person. That shape is going to hold across all 8. Let me pause for just a second because this genuinely helps. If you are getting value here, hit that like button, then subscribe and ring the bell. It costs you nothing, and it is the single biggest thing that keeps these videos coming. Scenarios 2 and 3, and both are about things people treat as negotiable that aren't.
Which is the whole character of this domain, really. It's the one that says no.
Professor Beaulieu is at the desk for these.
Close, though I'd resist calling it the domain that says no. It's the domain that says who and by what authority. That's a different and more useful framing because it tells you where to go rather than merely what you can't do.
Scenario 2. Task 2, Compliance. In month 5, you discover the customer sector requires all personal data to remain in country, and your architecture puts one service offshore.
And the tempting answer is to log it as a risk with a mitigation plan, which feels responsible and produces a nice register entry.
And it's a category error. A risk is an uncertain event that may or may not occur. A regulatory requirement isn't uncertain, it's already true, and it was true in month 1 while you were unaware of it.
So it isn't a risk, it's a constraint you've been in breach of without knowing. And you don't mitigate a constraint, you comply with it.
Which changes the whole response. Risks get monitored, constraints get designed around, and if the design already violates one, the design changes.
And there's a second obligation people miss. Discovering a compliance gap late is itself information the organization needs because it implies the compliance analysis at the start was incomplete. That's a process defect worth surfacing, not just a technical fix.
And there's a specific way to handle the discovery that keeps you honest. 2 separate actions, not 1. Fix the architecture and separately report that the compliance analysis missed this.
Because if you only do the first, The same gap recurs on the next project with a different regulation. The technical fix protects this delivery. The reported finding protects the portfolio.
Which nobody enjoys writing, and which is the difference between fixing a problem and fixing a process. Scenario 3, Task 3, Managing Changes. A senior stakeholder needs a change made this week. Going through the change board takes 10 days. He asks you to implement now and paper it afterwards.
And this is the most human request in the whole drill because he isn't being reckless. He has a real deadline and the process genuinely is slower than his need.
And the answer isn't to refuse, and it's not to comply. Urgency changes the route through governance, never the requirement for it. Most change bodies have an emergency path precisely because this situation is common.
So you find the expedited route, and if there genuinely isn't one, then the absence of an emergency path is the thing to escalate.
Because implement now, paper later isn't a shortcut through governance. It's a decision that governance never made, dressed up as one it did.
And there's a version of this that comes up more often than the dramatic one. The stakeholder doesn't ask you to skip governance. He asks whether this really counts as a change.
Which is a more sophisticated form of the same request, and the answer is the same test. Does it alter anything that was baselined? If yes, it counts, regardless of how reasonable the person asking is being.
And they usually are being reasonable, which is what makes it hard. Almost nobody asks you to break governance. They ask you to agree that it doesn't apply this once.
Professor Beaulieu, thank you. Urgency changes the route and never the requirement is the sentence I'd have people memorize from this episode.
Find the fast door. Don't remove the wall.
Scenario 4, Task 4, Impediments. Your team has been waiting 11 days for a security review that another department owns. They've chased it twice, nothing.
And the answer people reach for is to add it to the risk register, which is doing something that looks like management and changes nothing.
Because this isn't a risk. It has already happened. 11 days are gone.
And this is where Erica's question at the top gets its answer, so let's do it properly. A risk hasn't happened yet. An issue has happened and needs owning. An impediment is specifically something blocking the team that the team can't clear on their own.
And that last clause is the whole distinction. The team chased it twice and got nowhere, which is evidence they can't clear it. That's what makes it yours.
Michael is right, so the right move is to go and remove it, using whatever positional access you've that they don't. That's the task. Literally, remove impediments.
And there's a useful second question once you've decided it's an impediment. Ask what specifically you've that the team doesn't, because that tells you what your intervention should be.
Sometimes it's positional access, so you go and talk to a peer of the department head. Sometimes it's context, so you explain why the review is blocking 11 people rather than one ticket.
And sometimes, honestly, it's just that a request from you gets read differently than a request from a developer, which is uncomfortable and true and worth using. So when does a risk stop being a risk? Scenario 5, Task 5, Risk. In month 2, you logged a risk that your single integration specialist might leave. In month 6, he resigns. Your register still shows it as a risk, monitored, amber.
And the register isn't lying exactly. It's just describing a world that stopped existing when he handed in his notice.
So the first move is a piece of admin that sounds trivial and isn't. Reclassify it. It's no longer a risk, it's an issue, and issues get owners and actions rather than monitoring.
And the reason it matters is that a risk and an issue are handled by different machinery. A monitored risk gets reviewed at the next cycle. An owned issue gets a name and a date this week.
Which means leaving it classified as a risk quietly routes an urgent problem into a slow process. Nobody decided to do that. The label did it. And there's a second failure hiding in Scenario 5 that's worth naming. Nobody reclassified it, which means nobody was reviewing the register against reality.
A register that only ever gets added to becomes an archive rather than a management tool. The reclassification pass is the part that keeps it alive, and it's the part that gets skipped when things are busy.
which is exactly when it matters most, of course.
And before we get to the last three, notice that both of those answers were about naming the thing correctly before doing anything about it.
Scenarios 6 and 7, and these two are the ones practitioners recognize instantly and still get wrong on paper.
Improvement and adoption, tasks 6 and 7.
Professor Beaulieu back to the desk.
And both share a mechanism worth naming up front. In each case, something was produced that looks like the work but isn't. A logged action isn't an improvement. A completed rollout isn't adoption.
Scenario 6, Task 6, Continuous Improvement. Your team runs retrospectives every fortnight. The actions are captured carefully. Reviewing 6 months of them, you find 11 of 14 were never implemented.
And the tempting answer is to improve the retrospective. Better facilitation, tighter actions, a different format.
Which treats a delivery failure as a meeting failure. The retrospective worked. It produced 14 sound actions. What failed was everything after the meeting ended, and no amount of better facilitation reaches that.
So the right move is to give each action an owner and a place in the actual work, which usually means the backlog or the plan rather than a separate improvement list.
Because a separate list is where improvements go to be admired. If it isn't in the same queue as the delivery work, it loses to the delivery work every single time.
And there's a diagnostic worth running before you commit to fixing the retrospective machinery. Look at the 11 that failed and ask whether they were all the same shape.
Because they usually are. Improvements requiring somebody outside the team survive far less often than improvements the team can make alone. And that tells you the constraint isn't enthusiasm, it's reach.
So the ones that need another department are the ones that need you, which loops straight back to the impediment task.
Scenario 7, Task 7, Organizational Change. Your new expense system launched on schedule, on budget, fully tested, with training delivered to everyone. 8 weeks later, 60% of submissions still come through the old spreadsheet.
And the reflex is more training or a mandate. Both feel like the obvious lever.
And both assume the cause is ignorance or defiance. Neither is usually true. When capable people keep using the old way after being shown the new one, the old way is still doing something better for them, and nobody has found out what.
Which is diagnostic again. Go and watch somebody submit an expense the old way and find the step the new system made worse.
And it's usually small. 3 extra clicks. A field that needs a code they don't have. No way to save a draft. Something a training session would never surface because trainees follow the happy path.
And there's a trap in how you measure the fix too. Adoption percentage tells you whether it worked. It never tells you why it didn't.
So don't instrument harder in the hope of an explanation. A dashboard showing 40% adoption week after week is a very expensive way to learn nothing. 10 minutes beside one person produces the cause.
Which is a nice reversal, because the instinct with a low number is always to get a better number rather than to go and look.
Professor Beaulieu, thank you. A completed rollout isn't adoption is going straight onto a card.
Watch one person do it the old way. You will have your answer in 10 minutes.
Scenario 8, Task 8, and then the pattern. In month 7, the regulator publishes a change to reporting requirements that takes effect in 9 months. Your project delivers in 5.
So it lands after you go live, but before the first annual reporting cycle, which is exactly the position that makes people argue it isn't theirs.
And the tempting answer is to note it for the operations team and carry on, because your delivery date is unaffected.
Which misreads what the task asks. Evaluate external business environment changes means assess the impact on your project, not decide whether the date moves.
And the impact is real even though the date holds. You're about to deliver something that will be non-compliant 4 months after handover, and you know it now while changing it's still cheap.
So you assess, quantify, and route it through change control as a proposal. The board might well decide to let operations handle it later, and that's a legitimate outcome.
But it has to be their decision with your analysis in front of them, not your decision made by saying nothing.
So the pattern. Every one of those 8 answers came down to 2 questions, and Erica's question at the top was half of it.
The first is category. Is this a risk, an issue, an impediment, or a constraint? Because each one has different machinery, and putting a thing in the wrong box routes it to the wrong process.
Scenario 2 was a constraint filed as a risk. Scenario 4 was an impediment filed as a risk. Scenario 5 was an issue still labeled a risk. 3 of 8 lost on the box alone.
And the second question is authority. Who holds the decision right here, and have I actually been there? Scenario 1 was a person mistaken for a forum. Scenario 3 was a route mistaken for a requirement. Scenario 8 was a decision made by silence.
There's a third thread worth naming, and it's the one that connects this domain to the other 2. In 6 of the 8, the correct answer required telling somebody something they had not asked to hear.
The compliance gap, the reclassified risk, the regulation landing after handover, the 11 improvements nobody noticed had died. None of those arrive as a question you were asked.
Which is why this domain feels uncomfortable to study. It is largely about volunteering information that makes your project look worse in the short term.
And the exam rewards it every time, without exception, which is genuinely reassuring about what the credential is trying to certify.
Picture Nadia Haddad, a delivery lead with 10 years in regulated finance, who passed process comfortably and scored below target on business environment twice. She knew every definition. She kept answering as though she were the decision maker.
Emma, the fix was 2 words written above her desk. Which forum?
One honest caveat, because there's a real limit. Sometimes you genuinely do hold the decision. If governance gives you authority within a threshold and the change sits inside it, going to a board isn't diligence, it's abdication.
So who should lean on which question? If your misses are acting without authority, ask which forum. If your misses are handling things through the wrong process, drill the 4 categories until they're reflex.
If one thing survives today, make it this. Business environment is a quarter of your exam, and it's won by naming the thing correctly and then going to the right forum, in that order.
Which box? Which forum? In that order.
If this is the domain your scores keep sagging on, and for most people it's subscribing keeps the rest of the exam skills block coming as we finish it, and it costs you nothing. So tell me before you go, which of those 8 did you get wrong? And was it the box or the forum? Go write those 2 words down. This is Emma, and I'll see you in the next one.